thank you, Malcolm, and I'd like to thank Cafe for having me here to speak. I've never had a bell go off for me, so it's a special night. It's very special. And I want to begin with a song by a friend of mine named David Solway. He is a poet and an essayist, a non-fiction writer, and he's recently begun to write songs, and this song is going to be released in the fall. And I couldn't resist the idea of playing this song. It's a kind of red flag to feminist bull song. It's called "It's Time to Be Men Again." And I was thinking about men and the role that men have traditionally played in Western culture. I was thinking in particular about April 14th, 1912, the sinking of the Titanic, the fact that when that boat sank, 75% of the women on board survived, 18% of the men survived. The reason that was because that terrible patriarchy that they lived under believed in women and children first. All reports of the event told about how the majority of men on board went to their deaths patiently and stoically because they really actually believed that it was worthwhile to die so that complete strangers who just happened to be women could live. Of course, we remember lots of events about men's violence, men's brutality. We don't have a day that commemorates men's self-sacrifice and their heroism. Of course, I'm not saying that self-sacrifice and heroism are exclusive to men, but I think actually they are distinctive to men. And that's why I think it is time for men to be men again and to be able to be men again in our society. This, however, is a jokey song. It's not a serious song.
She walks right up. She starts to talk. She says, "You're gonna wear a frock. You're gonna sweep, do laundry and cook. You'll be reading from a book.
So that's a, oh. It's a deliberately over-the-top song, obviously outrageous, a little tongue-in-cheek, but still, I think, not entirely out of sync with a growing frustration with our man-hating society. And that's a little bit about what I want to talk about today. Before I even wrote the talk for this evening, the professional protesters knew what was going to be wrong with it and why it should be opposed. To be fair, some did have some idea. A week ago, or a little more than that, I was interviewed by the Toronto Metro newspaper, and I said a few things that seemed to me quite obvious, actually, and not particularly shocking about academic feminism. That it had what had started out as being about equality had become rather mean-spirited, a movement focused overwhelmingly on male aggression and women's moral superiority as victims to men. And I said that academic feminism's relentless attacks on men as dominating and oppressive have permeated the humanities disciplines to such an extent that men are justifiably fleeing them in droves. Despite or because of feminism's insistence on the sinister reality of the patriarchy, men are opting out of university in general, certainly the humanities where I teach. Men are opting out of university in ever larger numbers, their presence on campus now dwarfed by women, as any glance at the Maclean's survey of Canadian universities will reveal. And this is one of many facts on the ground that feminism cannot accommodate and largely ignores. If the numbers that you see in that Maclean's poll were reversed, and the number of women taking university degrees was declining every year, people would be talking about it constantly, and people are not talking about this, and it seems to me a serious problem that deserves to be addressed. Now, it would have been silly of me to expect that most feminists would, by and large, have agreed with my reported statements, and not surprisingly, those who were also interviewed in the Metro article didn't agree with me. And so I want to just address a couple of their responses, which were interesting to me, not for the disagreement, but for the various evasions and false assumptions in how they framed their disagreement, which I think illustrate the contention that I'm making tonight, that modern-day academic feminism, as it is practiced and disseminated in our universities, is overwhelmingly intellectually empty, incoherent, and dishonest. A woman identified as a prominent Toronto feminist countered my statements by saying that I didn't understand feminism because feminists don't target men, but instead target systemic injustice. They target the patriarchy. The patriarchy. This is an evasion, seems to me, of the first order, for as everybody who has studied feminism knows, feminists themselves have consistently defined it so, the patriarchy is defined as a system that privileges men and disempowers women. So, according to the feminist narrative, then men are to feel better because they are not being blamed individually and personally for the rotten state of the world, only collectively and impersonally. And this is not exactly a comfort to those who allege bias. Certain men, of course, get a pass from feminists in certain contexts, but the fundamental feminist tenet remains that all cultures are patriarchies that support and maintain men's power and perspectives at the expense of power and perspectives, often through violence, threats of violence, or other more subtle forms of control. The woman interviewed in the Metro argued that I was wrong to blame feminists for men's anger or to encourage men to blame feminists, because feminists, she said, are actually on the side of men, concerned about men's issues. According to this woman, the patriarchy hurts men too because it, quote, confines them to narrow gender roles, causing the very problems the men's issues groups are trying to address. And according to her, the men's issues groups are addressing these problems incorrectly. Feminists have the answer. And so I really thought about that. Are feminists concerned about the disadvantages of men in our society, the harms that they experience? Well, what about the harm of a criminal justice system in which police officers now, almost without exception, will charge a man with assault if his intimate partner claims that he has assaulted her, even with no evidence for the charge? The other way around, police are extremely reluctant to charge a woman if a man alleges assault from his intimate partner. That seems to me a pretty obvious injustice. What about the harms of a family law system that overwhelmingly awards custody to the mother and denies the father's rights and claims to be involved in his children's lives? What about the harms, and this is the one that I know the most about, that I have personal experience with and that has infuriated me consistently, what about the harms of an affirmative action hiring system widely practiced in government and academia, in which men are systematically disadvantaged, passed over time and time again in hiring competitions in favor of women, often less qualified women, all in the name, of course, of gender equality? What about the harm of a society that institutionalizes the concern about violence against women, sometimes, often explicitly labeled male violence against women, but doesn't talk about violence against men? Are these the harms that are caused by the patriarchal system? Or are they the result of a biased feminist worldview which has significantly permeated the media, the justice system, academia, and the family law system? So I wonder, are feminists concerned about these harms? Are they lobbying against them in our society? Are they speaking out on these issues with anger? Are they teaching about them in their gender studies classes? When they are, and I do not think they are, then I will agree that feminists and feminism aren't the problem. The feminist interviewed by the Metro reporter recommended that men who are feeling alienated or lost should consider joining an organization like the White Ribbon Campaign, which, according to her, challenges sexism and fosters a positive kind of masculinity. The clear implication, of course, and this is the clear implication of much feminist theorizing, is that a positive kind of masculinity is one that isn't really very masculine at all. Anyone who has taken a feminist course at university knows that the adjective masculinist, quite unlike feminist, is a dirty word. It means all sorts of negative things that nobody would ever want to emulate. And this is rich indeed for this advocate of gender justice to instruct men in how they should and should not express themselves, how they should and should not organize. How generous and inclusive of her to extend to men the opportunity to join a feminist sanctioned anti-violence movement, which just happens to be a movement that focuses on male violence against women. So in other words, in response to men's objections to the feminist targeting of men as uniquely violent, she advocates that men join an organization targeting men as uniquely violent. The arrogance of the recommendation seems to me quite stunning, and it proves to me that this person and her movement are not about equality, not about justice. This is about power. If feminists were really concerned about equality, then the very phrase violence against women would repel them. Why are male victims of violence, and there are certainly many of them, far more than there are female victims of violence, why are they of so little consequence? Why should men join a movement that cannot spare any concern or activist zeal for their suffering and violent death? Imagine if there were dozens of organizations in our society with a stated commitment to stopping mother violence against children. They would have a point, of course, because children under the age of 12 are far more likely to be killed by their mothers than by anyone else. Mothers represent about 45% of those who kill children, far outnumbering all other categories of child killers. But we can imagine the outcry by feminists if the media focused relentlessly on mother violence against children, if we had marches to stop mother violence against children, if we saw banners constantly saying we should stop mother violence against children, if there were a mauve ribbon campaign to raise awareness of mother violence against children, and so on. Discriminatory, they would say. Unfairly tarnishing all women, all mothers, for the actions of a small number. Why don't they recognize then the discrimination inherent in male violence against women, which also tarnishes all men for the violent actions of a few? These, it seems to me, are the obvious and necessary questions that feminists need to face if their movement is to claim ethical legitimacy. To give the Toronto feminist who was interviewed by the Metro her due, she did say that she didn't agree with those who would try to stop CAFE from holding talks on university campuses. Instead, she said it's better to go, listen to the speaker, ask hard questions, and engage in a dialogue. Good for her on that score. I salute you, Steph Guthrie, for those fair-minded words. We live in a strange culture indeed, in which far too many members of so-called social justice groups claim the right to be harshly critical of those whom they oppose. But the moment anyone is critical of them, want to put a stop to their opponent's words. So one is very pleasantly surprised to meet an activist for justice these days who actually believes in free speech. In the Metro article, a young feminist and social justice advocate named Heather said she didn't think a talk criticizing women's studies belonged at the University of Toronto. Imagine that, a talk about academic feminism not deserving a place at an academic institution. Why not? Because, in her words, such criticism, I don't know if I have it. No. Sorry, couldn't remember if I'd put it up there. In her words, such criticism is disrespectful to all of the female students and staff at U of T. When I read that accusation, I just wondered how it is that a movement that started out calling for access and equality for women became so defensive, so illiberal, and so foolish in its charges. Why would it be disrespectful to demand of a movement that it be rigorous in its arguments and accurate in its claims? Why would it be disrespectful to hold women at university to a high standard of reasoning and integrity? Why would it be disrespectful to take seriously the claims about justice on which feminists have so often based their right to speak and organize? So this is what I'm calling on all of you to do in your encounters with academic feminism. To exercise your critical intelligence in assessing feminist arguments and worldview, and never to abandon your commitment to a fair-minded consideration of all relevant facts and perspectives on a scholarly subject, to maintain a high standard of evidentiary proof and reasoning, to use logic rather than emotion in coming to your conclusions about justice. If that's now considered disrespectful, then I'm proud to be so considered. Well, to pause here for a moment, with full disclosure, as they say, 20 years ago, I was a radical feminist graduate student who read and loved Andrea Dworkin, worked part-time at a rape crisis center, and marched to take back the night, full of, in W.B. Yeats's words, passionate intensity. In those days, I would have hated anyone, like me, who criticized the influence of academic feminism on campus. And I would have said to a critic like me that it was disingenuous to criticize women's studies for failing to measure up to some non-existent ideal of pure objectivity or pure scholarship. I would have said there's no such thing as pure scholarship. All disciplines have vested interests, all carry the biases of their surrounding culture, whether it be the woman-hating, Eurocentric, white supremacist biases of Western countries, etc. I would have said women's studies is merely more honest than the others in clarifying what its interests are. That's what I would have said then, yet here I am now to say that I was wrong. After 15 years working as a professor in a discipline that has been extensively shaped by feminist theory, I have come to the conclusion that much of what passes for women's studies scholarship today needs to be fundamentally rethought. Academic feminism has lost its way, far from being honest about its biases and scrupulous in analyzing systemic structures. It has become the institutional arm of a special interest advocacy movement that has far more to do with shoring up power than with really investigating in all their dimensions women's experiences. One of the problems of academic feminism is that it is so secure, so influential, that its need to find enemies has led it into duplicity and ideological narrowness. There just aren't that many legitimate enemies around, especially in the academy anymore. A fact that undoubtedly contributed to the silliness we saw last November at Warren Farrell's talk, when a man who isn't an enemy of woman, a man who merely dissents from some tenets of what has sometimes been called rape crisis feminism, is treated as if he were a dangerous villain and author of hate speech. The sheer frivolousness of this branch of feminism is revealed when students are so falsely invested in some idea of being oppressed by the patriarchy that they feel justified in hurling abuse at those attempting to attend the talk, and actually give the Heil Hitler salute to the police officers attempting to keep order at the event, as if there were any remote equivalence between the position of students protesting at the University of Toronto and the position of Jews under Nazi totalitarianism. That hollow self-posturing is laughable and pitiable. Feminism, in fact, has been so successful, it has swept through the academy with next to no resistance, that its claims of being a movement of those outside of power look like just pure false posturing. But it has to maintain such claims because its whole reason for being depends on an activist orientation towards women's position in society. And this, I think, is the fundamental contradiction of a purportedly scholarly discipline based on an ideological agenda. It can't admit when its reform goals have been achieved, because to do so would be to radically weaken the claimed necessity of its continued existence. So it must always find new wars to fight, new sources of inequality to decry, and that also means, therefore, that the discipline can't really be at base about the pursuit of truth. It must always be advancing its ideological agenda, maintaining its worldview, by whatever means necessary. And so what I want to do now for the rest of the talk is just take a glance at a couple of course descriptions that I came across and selected almost completely at random to talk about the kinds of biases that are inherent in women's studies that I think disqualify it from claiming any kind of academic legitimacy. This is the first one. This course, called Gender and Violence, this course provides a feminist exploration of the historical, social, emotional, and psychological impacts of violence. We will quarry spaces and ideas not always defined as violent, but which nonetheless sustain violent relations. Analysis of the fantasies, representations, and ideologies that structure hegemonic masculinity, racism, and homophobia will be important to our thinking. Emphasis will be placed on artistic responses to violence and creative attempts to work through trauma and suffering, which result from the violence of living in phobic cultures. Well, first let me note that this course could potentially be interesting. I have no objection in theory to a course examining how women and people of color, I assume, respond to violence. I don't, of course, know precisely how this course is taught, so some of what I am about to say is admittedly speculative, but as you'll see, there are certainly quite a few pieces of evidence about the approach available from the description alone. I want to begin with the claim to neutrality, or the suggested neutrality of that title, Gender and Violence. Does this mean that the course examines the intersection of gender and violence in a variety of contexts, some of them conflicting? Does it reveal the manifold ways that women and men are violent? Would it include, for example, the surprisingly high incidence of violence amongst lesbian intimate partners? Roughly the same rate, I didn't know this when I took feminist courses, roughly the same rate as for women in heterosexual partnerships. A fact that in itself, it seems to me, invalidates hundreds, a small library of claims about heteropatriarchal misogyny. Would it include the fact that men report spousal violence at a rate very close to that of women? Almost 50-50. Now, there are certainly interesting, the science of reading statistics and taking polls and all that is very interesting, and it's not my subject area. But anyone who looks at these statistics has to see that women have no monopoly on being victims and men no monopoly on being perpetrators. But this isn't the messy picture that women's studies tends to present. The course description mentions also, has that statement about quarrying spaces not usually considered violent. The suspiciousness of feminism was once its strength and is now its weakness, the determination to find violence everywhere, even in seeming safe spaces. The course description mentions also that it will consider analysis of the fantasies, representations, and ideologies that structure hegemonic masculinity, racism, and homophobia. Here is where the course description most clearly shows its hand, as it were, revealing the rigid ideology governing its discussion of violence. And this is what has marked academic feminism over the last couple of decades, has been this rapidly expanding list of categories of oppression added to the core narrative of victimization after being criticized for the oversimplified version of power relations that feminism offered. It did not, in most cases, make its analysis more subtle and nuanced. Instead, it kept adding other modalities of oppression on the basis of race, of class, of culture, of sexuality, of religion, of age, of able-bodiedness, body size. It goes on and on and on, while seeming to offer a more complex view of social relations. Such multiplying categories merely make more monolithic the paradigm of oppressor and victim to which feminism is so firmly anchored. In this paradigm, homosexuals are always subjugated by heterosexuals, never the other way around. People of color always subjugated by whites, never vice versa. This is a dangerously simple, manifestly inaccurate view of the world that serves little purpose other than the scoring of self-righteousness points and the shoring up of false claims to legitimacy through narratives of suffering. And this leads, I think, to the most serious and far-reaching failing of a politicized worldview, such as the one of academic feminism, the false and misleading view of Western culture that it offers. The course description, for instance, ends by referring to, quote, the violence of living in phobic cultures. Phobic is sort of one of these new buzzwords denoting excessive, irrational fear and loathing. There are, I think, such cultures in the world. Certainly, the Islamic Republic of Iran would spring to mind, where boys of 16 are hanged for the crime of homosexuality, and morality police tour around on the lookout for a woman in the presence of a man other than her brother or father. North Korea, a closed society so dysfunctional that significant segments of the population have been forced to eat grass to survive while still saluting the dear leader who protects them. But I suspect, from the reference to hegemonic masculinity, racism, and homophobia, that the course framer is referring to Western culture. Few women's studies professors would be so politically incorrect as to refer to the multiple inequalities of a non-Western culture. These intersecting layers of domination, we're to understand, are the condition of all our lives here. Thus, what was once the University of British Columbia's Women and Gender Studies program has now morphed into the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. It bills itself as advancing feminist and post-colonial research, quote, that centers on diversity, equality, gender, racialization, sexuality, community, minority writing, transgender studies, indigenous studies, international development, intercultural understanding, and social sustainability. What could all of these diverse subjects possibly have in common to be coherently and comprehensively studied except their collective emphasis on victim identities and their common attack on the purported source of all injustice in the world, Western democratic culture? The irony, of course, is that the very tolerance of the West is what has enabled all of these so-called transgressive studies to be so quickly adapted and accepted in the university with very little resistance. Significant contradictions exist within this interrelated matrix of victim studies, of course. Try bringing the politics of the Pride Parade into the course on gender in the Muslim world and see how that works. And there are certainly tensions between the different approaches. We have a scathing attack on Western ideologies of femininity coexisting very peculiarly with a very sympathetic, non-judgmental analysis of women in the Islamic world. We've certainly come a long way from Gloria Steinem's outraged denunciation of the woman-hating practice of female genital mutilation. Now her denunciation, of course, would itself be denounced as a gesture of imperialist condescension. So what can one make of a set of theoretical approaches that vilify Canadian society for its putative homophobia, misogyny, crimes against the environment, genocidal treatment of Aboriginal peoples, etc., while passing over in silence the honor-killing, wife-beating, confinement of women to their homes, and persecution and murder of homosexuals in the Islamic world? Here, for example, is a course description about gender in modern Islam. Note its very different emphasis compared to the previous course on gender and violence. Muslim women are highly politicized subjects in the modern world, where their bodies are made to carry the burdens of various religious and political ideologies. In this context, the study of the discourse of gender in modern Islam is especially important. What are ideal portraits of women and men in Islam? And how is this vision changing in the modern period? How do Muslim women and men envision their own ideal social, religious, and political roles? And what ideals are imposed upon them? A central question raised in this study is about authority in Islam. How is it structured? And who speaks for Muslims? In this course, we will seek to answer these questions through, etc. Here we are in another conceptual universe altogether. The course description contains none of the oppositional critique that was such a central part of the course on gender and violence. Note that the language related to oppression that occurred throughout the previous description is entirely absent here. There's no mention of violence, hegemony, racism, homophobia, suffering, trauma, or phobic. The most frequently mentioned word after modern and Islam is ideal. The course examines the ideal visions of gender within Islam. That's very interesting, of course, but what about the reality? Imagine taking a course on feminism in Canada that focused mainly on the ideals of gender produced within Canadian culture while saying nothing about the realities belied by such ideals. It wouldn't be a feminist course. On the question of authority, the course description asks who speaks for Muslims, suggesting that one element of the course is likely to talk about Western appropriations of Islamic self-representation. The course is going to lament that Muslims are prevented from speaking for themselves by Islamophobia. How striking that there's no mention here about the oppression of women in the Muslim world, about the rigid separation of the sexes, about the phobic emphasis on sexual purity, about the meaning of women's forced covering, about the murder of Christians, about forced conversions, about the destruction of churches, about the death penalty for apostates, about the vicious dehumanization of Jews as the descendants of apes and pigs. There's something seriously askew here, a series of courses that imposes one standard of critique on Western society and another standard on non-Western ones that excoriates the imperfections of the West while maintaining a vigilant silence about the blatant violence and cruelty of other cultures in the name of some kind of sham respect or self-awareness. This is a discipline that has come entirely unmoored from any responsible framework of scholarship and cannot claim academic legitimacy. And I think this is a real shame because obviously there is a great deal to learn about women's experience historically, women's artistic expression, women's cultural production across the world. But women's studies is not only not teaching this well, but is actually preventing learning by substituting a callow set of slogans for real thought and substituting a smug sense of oppositionality, woundedness, and bitterness for the intellectual curiosity, openness to ideas, and eagerness to pursue truth that university education in the humanities is supposed to produce. Rather than giving students a well-informed, balanced understanding of the world they live in, academic feminism dwells obsessively upon group grievance, on the wounds of history and the injustices of the present. Its unbalanced worldview prevents rational discussion about a range of pressing social issues, substituting melodramatic and debate-ending cries of sexism or racism for fair-minded analysis of the merits of an argument. It is a reactionary dogma insisting on ideological conformity and vicious in its personal attacks on those who disagree with any of its claims. It teaches contempt for the freedoms, tolerance, and generosity of our own admittedly imperfect society while fostering a corresponding naivete about conditions in other cultures and a misconception of the unprecedented opportunities for self-fulfillment and security that women have achieved in Canada. As such, women's studies fails to equip young people to recognize what is worth preserving in our culture, how we came to be where we are, and how to make decisions about the future. So my challenge to you all tonight is to be true scholars, real thinkers, genuine intellectuals. For those of you who are doing feminist work, let it be genuine feminist work. Be open to evidence that might take you in surprising directions. Research your subject fully. Do not mistake self-righteousness for scholarly passion. It's an intoxicating emotion, but it is ultimately hollow and unreliable. And avoid the easy temptation of blaming the usual suspects. For those men and women of goodwill here tonight who are uneasy with things you hear in your university classrooms, educate yourselves so that you can challenge the myths of academic feminism. And do it with style, not with nastiness, not with slander, not with personal attack, especially not with hatred. This is difficult because it means, the challenging, not the avoiding hatred, it's difficult to challenge these orthodoxies, and they are orthodoxies, because it means you have to be twice as good as the others in your class. You not only have to know their theory, but you have to know how to oppose it. And you have to be strong enough to withstand all the blowback you'll get from swimming against the tide. But do it and revel in having truth on your side. Be calm, be rational, be tireless, partner with others who value fair debate and informed analysis, Don't give in to the dangerous temptation of censoring those with whom you disagree. Debate them civilly, believe in yourself and your cause. I'm not sure that the tide of feminist propaganda that has had such a culture-wide impact on Canadian society can be turned back anytime soon. But it starts one person at a time, and it is the right thing to do. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks everyone. Thank you, Janice, for your very informative talk. So we're going to have Heidi and Hartley from CAFE come up briefly to describe who they are. Then try and look what the CAFE is about. And I'm going to give a brief update on what's happening with one of our groups at Ryerson, and then we'll have to open the floor for Q&A. So we've got microphones at either end of either aisle, and we'll give everyone 45 seconds to ask a question, and we'll ask them to start. So Hartley and Heidi, if you could join us, please.
Good evening. My name is Heidi Nabert. I am an advisor with CAFE, and would like to just share a few things as to why I got involved with CAFE. A little history about myself. I survived my parents' divorce at age 5, which was the end of my relationship with my father. This is many, many years ago. I'll tell you it was in the early 60s when my parents separated and subsequently divorced. Today, for the last 20 some odd years, actually 30 years, I've been an activist in trying to change the way the family law system separates fathers from their children. I can tell you from my own personal experience the devastation as a young girl, a teen, and subsequent young woman of not having a male figure in my life who I could call my father. So myself and my partner have been running a support group in Toronto for 20 years, assisting fathers who are going through a really tough time. I think one of the things that perhaps wasn't mentioned this evening is that men too have emotions and feelings. We just, as a society, don't embrace that and allow you to feel those things. The truth is, men and women are human beings, regardless of your orientation, your religious background, and your marital status. It's a very emotional roller coaster when you're going through a family breakup, married or not. So what I wanted to share with you this evening is that I think the whole concept of the Canadian Association of Equality centers around true equality. I'll be honest with you, I've never taken a women's studies course, and I'm deeply shocked at how centered the whole concept of women's studies is and how it's centered around violence. That's really disturbing to me. I'm going to read something to you that shocked me this week. Two items. One's sort of absurd, and the other one is actually something I'm applauding. The first one, a couple in Lindsay, Ontario this week made international headlines. Husband and wife, or I guess they were partners, I don't know if they were married, were in a bar, and they were fighting over who was going to get the last beer. And they ended up doing a food fight between chips and dip, and they were both covered in chips and dip. The long short of it is they were both arrested for assault. Now, I didn't know that chips and dip were assault weapons, but apparently in Ontario they are. So at least the change is starting that in a situation like that, both parties who were equally involved and equally guilty of these assaults were arrested. On another note, and I have to read this, St. Michael's Hospital Emergency Room Protocol, which is in downtown Toronto, has changed its abuse protocol. The emergency department at St. Michael's Hospital in downtown Toronto has announced the inclusion of all genders in its abuse screening program. This is an extension of their successful women's abuse screening that began in 2010. Why are they now including men as part of the screening? A lifetime prevalence of abuse in a straight man's life is 6%. This increases for men in same-sex relationships to 12%. For those men who are Aboriginal, 18%, the elderly, 10%. And lastly, for people identifying themselves as trans, whether it be male to female, female to male, they are at the greatest risk. Gender-neutral pamphlets outlining abuse and where to seek help are now available at this hospital. That's pretty groundbreaking, in my opinion, and long overdue. If you agree with this, I would encourage each and every one of you to contact the hospital administration at St. Michael's Hospital and thank them. I cannot tell you how many times in the last 20 years we have been contacted by men who have been physically harmed, where they've had blood on their bodies, face, hands, cuts, and they are the ones that were arrested. Their wives or their partners were the ones with the knife or the frying pan. The women were not arrested. This is wrong. It's wrong. So that's my story. That's my passion, to try and change things, to equalize things. Cafe is focused on equality, and I stand by equality. And true gender equality means that I, as a woman, can drive a dump truck, and any other man in this room can stay home, vacuum, and take care of the kids and be proud of it. Just as my mother was when she was a stay-at-home mother. That's true equality. But we don't see that. And we need to encourage that. And I encourage all of you to please join. I'm going to pass this over to Hartley now. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I had a little paper made up, and I thought I was going to read a few things, and a friend of mine pulled it from out of my hand and says, you know what, speak from the heart. About 5 years ago, I separated from my ex right now, and I have 2 little daughters. And my life changed at that point. Today I walked in the court and said, you know, I like to see equal share parenting done within the situation. It looked like my head was turned inside out. Everybody looked at me like I was weird. Like I could not be a father to these 2 little girls. You know, I grew up in a house in Jamaica with 2 grandma, 1 mom, 2 sisters, no dad, right? And nevertheless, at this point in my life, I'm in a home where I have 3 teenager girls, and when my daughters come over, there's another 2 girls, so I'm in a house now with 6 women. And it bothers me that I cannot provide proper parenting for my girls. Because at the end of the day, I don't ever want my girls to grow up thinking that they can behave in a certain manner, act in a certain manner, and benefit from a certain amount of, how should I say it, sense of empowerment. And this is wrong. This is absolutely wrong. I got involved, I'm a board member with this group, and I got involved because at the end of the day, I just want to be a dad. And I just want to be seen as fair as where the system is concerned. Right? I have battled with the FRO, and you know something? When I look at everything now, that'll be going on for another 5, 6, 7, 9, 10 years. How does that help me be a father? That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm just going to speak very briefly about our campus group. As probably some people in the audience know, we have been supporting and sponsoring a campus group called the Ryerson Association for Equality. The students involved wanted to be here tonight, but they had some academic commitments, so unfortunately they couldn't make it. They have been very generous with their time this week. They've done a fair bit of media for us, so we're disappointed, but we understand that they can't be here. So just before this talk, the leader of the group, Sarah, texted me and let me know that the decision on whether or not their group will be ratified will be deferred for a couple days. The decision was supposed to be made just a couple hours ago. That was where they were before this talk. The RSU decided to delay the ratification for reasons unknown. Personally, I think it was that I couldn't come up here and tell you that the group had not been ratified. But the reason I think they're not going to be ratified is because on Monday, the student union changed their policies on, I think it was their women's policy, to specifically exclude the concept of, or specifically oppose the concept of misandry, which, for those of you that don't know, is effectively the male equivalent of misogyny, and oppose any group that did not center women's voices in gender discussions. Now, after we gave up trying to reconcile the claims that men do not face discrimination with their insistence that the group discriminate against men, we did think how very timely it was, though, that that happened the week that we were having a talk on censorship in academia. There is still a lot of ground to cover in the pursuit of equality. Just like the idea of a just society, it's a goal we can probably never fully reach. But we can certainly never get there when those in power, even if it's a relatively small power role like this, like a student union, if they refuse to acknowledge that all people of all genders have their own unique experiences and challenges. As men's issues gain more prominence in the media and in public discourse, we have to be careful not to fall into the same trap of censorship, bullying, and misrepresentation that holds some of our critics. The protest that Dr. Farrell faced in November shows us where that leads. It's only by being open-minded and giving everyone a chance to have their voices heard that we can make positive change. Divisive, partisan bickering is an unwelcome distraction when we're talking about the health and well-being of the next generation. If you're listening tonight and you're a Ryerson student who believes in equality and freedom of speech, please let your student union know that you want this group ratified, that you support free expression on campus. If you're a student of another university and you're interested in these sorts of issues, please do get in touch with us. We want to get as many campus groups going as possible, and we'll support you to the best of our abilities in getting your own group going. If you're a member of the general public, you're not involved with any academic community, you can help us by making people aware of these sorts of issues. If you see examples of misandry, whether it's dismissing a male voice, belittling someone because of their gender, mention it, name it. That's what's ultimately going to raise awareness. As ordinary people, we can have all the talks in the world, but unless normal people start thinking about these kinds of things, it's not going to change. So you'll get your share of blank stares, but change comes from action, even if it is a very small action. So thank you very much for listening. We're going to start the Q&A. We're going to have Malcolm here moderating. We've got microphones there, and we ask everyone to please restrict your questions to 45 seconds.